Good evening, Mr. Ritter.
Good evening. How are you?
Before we start with the actual conversation, I would like to represent you. And of course, you are going to tell me if what I know about you is true.
Well, we'll find out.
Yes. To our audience, I have the honor and privilege to represent Mr. William Scott Ritter, who is an American author, pundit, former United States Marine Corps intelligence officer, former United Nations Special Commission weapons inspector. Mr. Ritter served as a junior military analyst during Operation Desert Storm in Iraq. He then served as a member of the United Nations Special Commission, overseeing the disarmament of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq from 1991 to 1998, from which he resigned in protest. He later became a critic of the Iraq War and United States foreign policy in the Middle East. His most recent book is Disarmament in the Times of Perestroika. Well, Mr. Ritter, what do you think?
I think you did a great job.
Thank you. Well, what would you add to your representation? If
I would just say that I view myself as an American patriot who loves my country and believes in the potential of my country, and am saddened by the fact that the policies of successive presidential administrations appear to be deviating from what we're supposed to represent. And that's one of the reasons why I speak out the way I do. And I have dogs who are misbehaving now, so hopefully they'll calm down.
Luckily, you still possess as a nation the freedom of speech, because in many other countries this is not happening right now.
No, we do have. I mean, we do have the right of free speech. The reality, though, is that this right can be and is being suppressed in many different ways. The government's ability to influence mainstream media and the leverage they can place on mainstream media not only dictates a narrative, but it also blocks other voices from being brought into mainstream media. So if you're not playing the game, you don't get the invitation. And then you're compelled to carry out what in the military we call an indirect approach attack, to come in using other venues such as this.
This is invisible.
Well, but see, by coming here, then I'm not invisible. And by doing this on other podcasts and such, you're. And then if the quality of your argument is sufficient, then you gain traction and you're brought back in, and then they feel threatened and they shut down your Twitter account. And so, it's even though there is free speech, it's not as automatic. Yes, I don't have jackbooted police officers kicking down my door and hauling me away, but the difficulty of getting my message, or what I would say, not just my message, but a counter narrative projected into the mainstream of American society, it's very difficult. If I played the game and decided to say what the government wanted me to say what Fox News wanted, then I'd be on Tucker Carlson's show every night. I'd be on Rachel Maddow's show. And everybody would hear my words. But that's not happening. So we have to do it a different way, and that's why I'm grateful for you inviting me on your podcast. This is one of the ways to counter.
We who are very thankful to you. Well, if you agree, we can start already with the question.
Sure.
The first one. Well, when we will date the start of the conflict in the Ukraine, some geopolitical analysis go back to 2008 and the promise NATO made to accept Ukraine and Georgia. Another possible date is, of course, 2014, the Maidan Putsch. Others point out to 2016 and the so-called Russian interference. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would even go back further to 1990, 1989, 1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the assurances that were given by the United States and European leaders, NATO leaders, to Mikhail Gorbachev, who was at that time the head of the Soviet Union, that NATO would not expand, that not 1 inch eastward is a direct quote about NATO. So, and then once NATO did begin expanding under Clinton, you have to ask yourself why. What was the reason behind it? And the reason is NATO can't exist without a threat, and that threat had to be manifested in the way of Russia. So Russia has always been targeted by an expansive NATO. It didn't happen, and it didn't just start in 2008. This is why when you read the Russian draft treaties that were submitted in December of 2021 to the United States and NATO, they talk about withdrawing NATO's military infrastructure back to the 1997 lines.
Precisely.
And so, so clearly, from the Russian perspective, the difficulties with NATO predate 2008. 2008 is important not only because of the decision to invite the Ukrainians and the Georgians, but also the policy shift that was made away from the Bush administration, George W. Bush, which spoke of, remember the president said, "I looked into Putin's eyes and I saw his soul, and it was a man I could deal with," etc. Well,
yes, I remember that.
Yes, Obama wasn't playing that game. Obama said Putin has stepped aside. They've replaced him with Dmitry Medvedev, and Obama said, "We're going to conduct regime change here. We're going to ensure that Putin never comes back into the presidency. We're going to co-opt Dmitry Medvedev in a way that was similar to the co-option of Boris Yeltsin in the period of the 90s. But we didn't call it regime change. We called it the Russian reset. And you remember there's that little yellow box with the red button and the misspelled word, and they pushed it and they laughed, they chuckled. But the Russians knew what was going on. This wasn't about being friendly with Russia. This was about basically keeping Putin out and co-opting Dmitry Medvedev. It failed. 4 years later, Medvedev returned to the prime minister's office. Putin won an election in March of 2012, and since that point, the American policy has solidified around a de facto regime change. Now we've been seeking to undermine Russia, to destabilize it economically, and then to create what RAND Corporation has called in a 2019 study a crescent of instability on Russia's border regions, again, designed to strip away territories from the Russian sphere of influence and create instability that will further weaken Russia, creating the conditions for the collapse of the Russian economy and Putin's political support, so that Putin is evicted and a new pro-American president is brought in. This has been the policy. Now, if I said this to you in flipping the script, saying that Russia's policy is to go into Mexico and create an area, a region of instability where we would install a pro-Russian government that was designed to create instability in the American near abroad, but in this case, we'd call it California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, the former territories of Mexico that the United States now operates on. And we're doing it in a way that is designed to collapse public support for the American government, achieve the overthrow of our constitutional form of government. We'd say, no, we're going to kill you. And I would gladly participate in a military conflict designed to defeat that threat, because that is a real threat. But why is it fair for us to recognize that as a threat? But when Russia recognizes as a threat, we say that Russia is grossly irresponsible, provocative, etc. Because we don't deal with reality, we deal with perception. This is the whole concept of the narrative coming out of Washington, D.C. It's not a reality-based narrative. It's a narrative based upon trying to shape the perception of the American people, the European audience, and the international community that Russia is the perpetual bad guy, led by the number one bad guy in the entire world, Vladimir Putin. And that's where we are today. It's the level of ignorance that's stunning, but the danger of the American approach is manifest. I mean, we are talking about nations with nuclear weapons. We're talking about nations that if they go to war against one another, the conflict could readily become a nuclear conflict. And then we're talking about a conflict that means the end of all humanity in the world. So everybody listening, if you're not American, you're not Russian, you live somewhere else, I'm here to tell you that this involves you, because once nuclear weapons are employed, the consequences of that are global in scale and more than likely lethal in consequence.
Mr. Ritter, what do you think? Is the end of that conflict coming any sooner, or it's just a prelude to a major war?
The end of the Ukrainian conflict?
Right.
You know, only fools pretend to have a crystal ball and can tell you the future. So I'm a fool. I don't have a crystal ball, but I'll answer your question because I respect you and I respect the question. It's a fair question, but please understand that I don't have a crystal ball, and the fact set that I'm using today can dramatically change. To give you an example, if you had asked me in March of last year what I thought the trajectory of the conflict would be, how was I to know that in May the United States would inject $45 billion worth of military assistance to the Ukrainian army and change the thing? You couldn't know. So when you make an evaluation in March and you don't know what the future is, and frankly speaking, based upon the rhetoric coming out of the West, nobody could have predicted that we would have suddenly thrown $45 billion worth of military equipment into the Ukrainian military. So, you know, the things can change, just like, you know, if you could tell me in June of last summer that Vladimir Putin was going to carry out a partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists. You didn't know that in June, and yet that changed everything. So here I am talking today with a fact set that I believe is a fairly mature fact set. I don't think it's going to change very much. The Russians have accrued significant military advantage. The Ukrainians have suffered significant military loss. The Russians continue to be mobilizing, both from a defense industry standpoint and a manpower standpoint. Their casualties are manageable. The Ukrainians have unmanageable casualties, horrific casualty rates, and the West is unable to resupply them in a sufficient manner to change the outcome. I think it's safe to say that Russia is going to win this war and that the Russian victory will come sometime this summer or early fall. And the key indicator there is logistical sustainability of critical munitions, in particular 155 millimeter artillery shells. This is a war that has become defined largely by artillery, and especially on the ground side of it. And the Russians, you know, have a significant numerical advantage, and they have the ability to fire more artillery rounds per tube than the Ukrainians. But nevertheless, the Ukrainians have acquired certain qualitative capabilities in terms of Western artillery systems. And so long as they are given sufficient munitions combined with intelligence, et cetera, they have been able to hold their own against the Russians. But that's going to come to an end. As Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, said, Ukraine will run out of artillery ammunition this summer, and there's nothing NATO can do to replenish it. There are no more rounds to give them. And if you're in an artillery-driven war and one side runs out of ammunition and the other side doesn't, I think that's indicative of the way things are going. Plus, we have a battle unfolding right now in Bakhmut that's taken on an extraordinarily strategic importance. And as President Zelensky has said, if Bakhmut falls, this will open up all of the Donbass to, Russian occupation or reoccupation, liberation, depending on whose point of view you take. And that is a game-changing development. So I just think that Russia has accrued significant advantages that are not going to go away, and that sometime by the end of summer, early fall, Russia will have defeated the Ukrainian army.
Well, does that mean that you don't believe much in these the talk about a spring offensive from the Ukrainian army? And this is being linked with the tanks that are currently being delivered and the promise for other heavy NATO military equipment. And also the suggestion somehow that the tide of the war will change because of that.
Well, right now we have 10, count them, 10 German Leopard A4 tanks on the ground in Ukraine. 10. I mean, that's nothing. So if that's what the Ukrainians are going to build their counteroffensive around, good luck. You know, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, if it occurs, can be one of two things. It can be a battle of the bulge moment where, like the Germans, they accrue, a considerable amount of military power, and then they expend it in one bold thrust that will more than likely be defeated by the Russians in short order, and then it's over. There's nothing left. That's the best the Ukrainians can hope for. A period of about a week's time where they are inflicting damage on the Russians. They may break through the initial Russian defensive line, but they're going to bog down in the second, the third. They'll be cut off, they'll be destroyed, and that's it. That's the best that can happen to Ukraine, and that's pretty bad. The worst that can happen to Ukraine is a reenactment of the bunker scene from the movie Downfall, where Hitler is with his generals in the basement of the Chancellery bunker, looking at a map, moving imaginary armies. And so the Ukrainian counteroffensive could be Zelensky with General Zaluzhny and other Ukrainian generals looking at a map as they move imaginary armies because they don't have anything to move. If the Russians break through at Bakhmut, which it looks like they're going to do, and they unravel the Ukrainian defenses and balloon into the Donbass, these Ukrainian reserves that are being built up will be expended in an effort to contain the Russian advance. There won't be a spring offensive, and that's where I personally stand on this issue. I don't believe there will be a spring offensive. I think the Ukrainian reserves are going to be rapidly, engaged and depleted as a consequence of Russia's looming victory in Bakhmut and a developing offensive into the Donbass.
Well, again, talking about the official narrative, we've been hearing since March 2022 that the Russians are running out of ammunition and they don't have missiles and so on. And even this week, the British press printed a report which alleges that the Russian forces around Bakhmut are using trench digging shovels in hand-to-hand combat. Obviously, that seems quite ridiculous, but is there any truth to this? How does it look from your side?
Well, I remember when I went through my training in the Marine Corps, we would take our entrenching tools and we would sharpen the edge and we would use them to cut down trees. We would use them to dig holes and we would practice decapitating people with them. They're a very effective weapon in hand-to-hand combat. So are Russians trained in this? Have Russians used their entrenching tools to decapitate Ukrainians in hand-to-hand combat? Probably. Just like Ukrainians have probably used their entrenching tools to decapitate Russians in hand-to-hand combat. This is war. It gets really ugly when it gets close up and personal like this. So, but this is absurd in the extreme. In Bakhmut, the primary assault forces are carried out by the Wagner private military company, but it's not a PMC anymore. It's treated as a volunteer unit of the Russian military because Lugansk and Donetsk are now part of Russia, and Russian law prohibits private military contractors. So, we call them a private military contract, but Wagner is now a volunteer military unit fully incorporated into the Russian defense establishment. Well, it's their nickname, yeah, and they're proud of it. They're very proud of it. But they're very efficient, capable combat troops who are doing a very difficult job against a very determined enemy. If you listen to Mr. Prigozhin, when he speaks of the Ukrainians, he only speaks of them in the highest terms. He said, you can never call these people cowards. He says, they are fighting. They're fighting hard. These are heroes, he said, heroes of Ukraine who are fighting us. We're killing them, but they're heroes. They're heroic. They're not cowards. And anybody who denigrates them as somehow being, less than the men they are is wrong. And I think you can say that for the vast majority of the Ukrainian army. They're losing right now, but they're not losing because they're cowards. They're losing because it's a very difficult fight against an enemy that's better prepared to carry out this fight than they are. But the Ukrainian army has performed very well, and they've inflicted significant casualties on the Russians. So I just think it's absurd, though. The British have been coming up with just ridiculous statements from day one about the state of the Russian military. Their casualty figures are, according to the British, the Russians have lost 200,000 men. That's the total number of men that were dedicated to this conflict back when it started. It's an absurd number. They've spoken about shortages of weapons, and yet ask the Ukrainians every day, who are obliterated by Russian artillery, does it seem as if the Russians are running out of ammunition? People say the Russians are running out of missiles. Then why did 81 of them get launched against Ukraine last night, 6 of which were Kinzhal missiles, the hypersonic missiles that can't be shot down? The fact that Russia is firing 6 of these in one salvo means that the Russians have resolved the production bottleneck, and they now have production lines producing these advanced weapon systems, according to some sources, running triple shifts. So rather than running out of missiles, Russia is increasing the stocks of missiles, and they're going to start employing them more and more and more. So the British are just dead wrong. I don't think the Russians walk on water. I think the Russians have made and will continue to make mistakes of a tactical nature, sometimes of an operational nature. The Russians aren't perfect, but when you look at it from just a purely military mathematical standpoint, the Russians have, they're suffering fewer casualties. They have greater replenishment capabilities. So for the losses they're suffering, they can replenish those and more. There is no ammunition shortage. There is no tank shortage. Sort of the mathematical equation balances out to their favor. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are losing men at a far greater rate than they can replace them. They're compelled to literally kidnap people off the streets to fill the ranks of their military. They're running around Europe with a tin cup in hand, begging for equipment and ammunition, which tells you that there is a deficit of it. So they have high losses and a very limited ability to replenish. And when you go high loss, limited ability to replenish, that means that you're getting weaker on a daily basis. The Russians have low losses, a high ability to replenish, which means they're getting stronger. So every day this war goes on, Ukrainians get weaker, the Russians get stronger.
I have already written some independent sources telling us that Russians managed to take Leopard 2 tank. What do you think? Is it true?
I'll believe it when I see the tank paraded in Red Square in Moscow. Until then, it's just a rumor.
Thank you. Well, my next question is, what does it mean to become a party in a war? NATO is supplying lethal weapons, which are used to shoot at civilians in Donbass and Russia, provides intelligence. It trains Ukrainian troops. There are reports that as much as 20,000 Polish volunteers are fighting for Ukraine. Yet everybody insists that NATO is not at war with Russia.
NATO is at war with Russia. NATO is a party to the conflict. The NATO nations are all direct parties to the conflict. The United States is a direct party to the conflict. Russia, however, can't act on that without risking a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, which is the last thing Russia wants. Remember this. Russia's winning this war right now, despite everything that's happening, despite all the crossing of the red lines, etc. Russia is winning. And so Russia isn't going to do anything that disrupts the current algorithmic advantages it has. So even though NATO is a direct party to the conflict, Russia isn't going to act on this by attacking NATO, because now you draw them directly into the conflict. Right now, NATO is indirectly a party to the conflict by providing assistance that makes it, under a normal circumstance, would make it, a legitimate target. But Russia's not going to take the bait. Russia's not going to escalate this conflict because Russia's winning this conflict. And I think we're going to see, as this conflict moves to its tragic conclusion, that NATO will continue to escalate in a desperate move to try and somehow help the Ukrainians turn the tide. And there will be more and more excesses, more and more provocations. But Russia will continue to be the adult in the room who understands that ultimately they're going to win, and that to respond to a NATO provocation is actually doing that which Ukraine wants you to do. Ukraine wants Russia to overreact. Ukraine wants Russia to do something that brings NATO directly into the conflict. So Russia's not going to play that game, even though they have every justification from a legal standpoint to do so. There is no doubt that if this was a war, let me put it this way. If I were the Russians, I'd be hitting Ramstein right now. I'd be hitting Brussels. I'd be hitting every air base that receives equipment, every port that receives equipment, etc. But then I'd be at war with NATO. Fortunately, Putin is 20 times smarter than me, and he recognizes that however viscerally good it would feel to strike back at NATO, as you have every legal right to do, it would be a bad move strategically because it would complicate this war and maybe even make it difficult for Russia to win this war. The last thing Russia wants is a stalemate. Russia does not want a Korea-type situation with a demilitarized zone that allows the Zelensky government to continue to survive and create ongoing problems for Russia for decades to come. Russia needs to decisively win this conflict, which means they have to not only defeat the Ukrainian military, but they have to collapse the Zelensky government politically. And they can't do this if NATO becomes a direct party to the conflict as opposed to an indirect party to the conflict. So the Russian government, the leadership is engaged in escalation management, meaning that every time NATO or Ukraine does something that should trigger a response, the Russians stop, they don't respond, because right now they're on a trajectory of victory. If you respond, you create unknown situations that you can't predict the outcome. Right now, as things stand, I believe the Russians can look at the situation and say, we predict that we will win. Therefore, there's no need for them to react to provocations because they're going to win no matter what. So they prefer to have victory as opposed to doing what the Ukrainians want them to do, which is to react or overreact to a provocation that then makes this war a far more complicated thing.
I'd like to go back again to the issue of the beginning of the war and the declaration that Putin made that one of the goals of this war is the denazification of the Ukraine. The thing that has always amazed me and continues to amaze me is that it's been only 70, 80 years since the end of World War II, and yet we're seeing the rebirth of neo-Nazi groups and ideology in the Ukraine, but already everywhere in Europe as well. And my question is, do you know who and why resurrected the specter of Nazism, and why the Europeans, some of whom still remember the horrors of World War II, go along with this official narrative? And also the media officially, even though in 2014 there was some documentaries, like the French television reported on the Azov battalions and the fact that they are neo-Nazis, currently they all seem to be suffering from some sort of historical amnesia.
Well, it's curious because there's anybody who talks about the neo-Nazi problem in Ukraine most likely says it's a resurgence or the emergence, the reemergence of it. I'll push back by saying it never went away. That when you take a look at the roots of modern Ukrainian nationalism, it has been dominated since the 1920s and 30s by Petlura and then Bandera. And Bandera is the most dominant force. The organization Ukrainian nationalism, very violent group, violent prone. Remember, in 1936, he was arrested by the Poles for murder. And he was put on trial. And he justified the crime by saying that he is, in order to make Ukraine a nation, he's willing to kill 1 million people. That's the mindset. He also the attitude of the Western Ukrainians was one that is always the cornerstone of movements like National Socialism, et cetera, the concept of racial supremacy, superiority, that the Western Ukrainian was superior to the Russian, superior to the Pole, superior to everybody. It was a pure race, a dominant race, a master race. And that attitude of supremacy also creates the possibility of mass violence, because it's easier to kill someone when you view them as subhuman. And we see this with the, and it's also virulently anti-Semitic, the Banderist ideology. And we see them act on this when they move into, what was Poland at the time, today Western Ukraine, and the initial capture of Lvov. They slaughtered Jews, ran them down, slaughtered them. The triggermen in Babi Yar in Kiev were Banderists working under German leadership. But the Banderist movement was a violent movement that was anti-Semitic, and anti-Polish and anti-Russian. I think most people are familiar, people who study Bandera are familiar with what happened in Volyn and what was then Poland from 1943 to 44, where the Banderists literally killed 110,000, primarily women and children, in the most horrible ways, stuffing them into buildings, setting them on fire, shooting anybody who ran out, raping, murdering, torturing. Belarus, they did the same thing. The number, there's a movie that was made about this that I don't encourage people to see sad movies, but if you want to get a visual depiction of what I'm describing here, see the movie. I can't remember the name of it right off the bat, but it follows a little boy in Belarus.
Go and See?
Pardon?
Go and See?
Go and See. That's the movie. And it's just a horrible movie to watch.
Yeah,
what I mean by that is not that it's a bad movie. I just mean it's a horrible movie. It's just shocking, and it's real. And this is Bandera. This is what Bandera does. There's another movie that the Poles made about Volyn. Same thing, the horrors of it all. It's real, but a struggle that hardly anybody talks about is what happened after 1945. You see, the Bandera movement was almost totally subordinated to the German Abwehr, the German intelligence. They received instructions. The Germans used them as an intelligence organization, as an extension of their special operations to carry out raids, attacks, etc. And in 1945, the Abwehr division that ran the Banderists, headed by a gentleman named Galen, his entire organization was taken over by the United States, which later became the CIA. So a Nazi human intelligence organization with an active network of pro-Nazi Banderist murderers numbering in the hundreds of thousands in Poland and in Western Ukraine, and Ukraine was controlled by the CIA, which ran a war, a secret war from 1945 to 1953 on the territory of Western Ukraine. Now, this isn't just a small war. Let's look at the numbers. During this period of time, 45 to 53, almost 50,000 Russian soldiers and security officers were killed in combat. 50,000. Almost 250,000 Russian civilians died, primarily because the Banderas would surround villages and slaughter them. Another 150,000 Banderists, insurgents, were killed. Another 150,000 fled Western Ukraine and took up diasporas in the United States and Canada and West Germany and Australia, where they continue to exist today, largely funded by, up until 1990, by the CIA. The CIA continued to support this movement. About 156,000 were captured by the Soviets and given long prison sentences in 1953, 54, sent to the Gulag. Some of these sentences were 25 years in length, which means they weren't coming home. But in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, as part of his de-Stalinization program, released them, released the Banderists back into Ukrainian society, where they re-engaged. They became school teachers. They became low-level officials. They became workers. And over the years, they rose and they were never denazified. They were never debanderized. These are people who continue to believe what they believe, and they spread their poison so that when Ukraine became independent in 1991, 1992 from the Soviet Union, it was the Banderists who were everywhere, controlling everything. So people are saying the reemergence, it never went away. It has always been there. And in 2014, we, the United States, actually enabled it to break out into the mainstream by carrying out a coup d'etat of Viktor Yanukovych's government using these CIA-backed Banderist organizations like Right Sector, like Sloboda Party, take power, then exploit their violent tendencies to dominate Ukraine. Today, Ukraine, Stepan Bandera is the national hero. They have major streets named after him. They have statues raised to him. They sing his songs for their anthems. The children of Ukraine now are held hostage to the children's cultural movement that has incorporated the Bandera Scouting organization as the number one organization. Every youth activity in Ukraine today must have the Banderas in charge of it, which means the brainwashing is taking place from a very early age up until today. This has never gone away. It's an infection. It's real, which means if the Russians are serious about denazification, they can't repeat the mistakes of the past. And I've spoken to, for instance, Mr. Azarov, who was the prime minister of Ukraine during the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych. He's now in Russia, and he's a part of the Ukrainian government in exile. And I talked to him about what denazification could look like, and he said straight up, it's going to be military government for a period of at least 2 to 3 years, probably more, where anybody who is tainted with the Banderist ideology, member of the political party, etc., will be arrested. They'll be put on trial, and in some cases, they'll be given lengthy prison sentences. In other cases, they'll be compelled to undergo re-education. But the bottom line is the Russians understand that that this cancer will never go away unless you subject it to political chemotherapy. And unfortunately, that's the future of Ukraine. It's not going to be pretty. It's going to be ugly. And as an American, I don't know how I feel about it because I'm not a big fan of re-education and all this kind of stuff. You know, here in the United States, we have the Ku Klux Klan. We have various hate groups. And we're like, as long as you don't kill people, you get to live, you get to protest, you get to say what you want. Freedom of speech is a double-edged sword, meaning sometimes people say things that you prefer they not say, but they have the right to say it. You know, the Banderists here in the United, they live right here. I got a whole bunch of them 60 miles away from me in Ellenville, New York, where they have Heroes Park, where they raise the statue of Stepan Bandera and other of the Ukrainian Nazi supporters. And every summer they hold giant children's camps where they have torchlight parades, wearing the brown uniform of the Banderas, carrying his thing, singing his songs. It's right here in America. Now, my gut tells me I'd want to shut that down. But in America, you can't. They have a right to exist. They have a right to say what they want. But in Russia, it's different. In Ukraine, it's different because it has manifested itself in systemic violence. This isn't a political movement, with words. This is a criminal movement that has murdered people. They have stuffed 150 ethnic Russians into a trade union building in Odessa, set it on fire, watched 48 of them die. These people have raped Mariupol. They have slaughtered thousands of people. They continue to slaughter thousands of people. And so I think the Russians are going to apply a very Russian solution to this problem. And it's not going to be nice. It's not going to be pretty. But I do believe it's going to be terminal for the neo-Nazis of Ukraine. The problem is they exist in diaspora. So you're never going to get rid of it. This is always going to be a perpetual problem, as the Ukrainian Banderas and diaspora will now glorify their movement even more, trying to do that bait and switch, because I've heard this before. Bandera wasn't a pro-Nazi guy, they say. He was simply somebody who had to fight with the Nazis against Stalin, the evil of communism, to promote Ukrainian nationalism. Well, that's cute and fancy with history. It's not that way, but I can see the Banderas in diaspora rewriting history to try and explain why the Russians are the new Stalin and they are the legitimate keepers of the flame of Ukrainian nationalism. And Russia's going to be in, and Europe's going to be in for a very long, continuous conflict between Nazi ideology and whatever government emerges in post-conflict Ukraine.
Well, that concerns a little bit because I can see also in the neighboring countries, the Baltic states certainly have also the fair share of Nazis marching, and in Bulgaria as well, we have a Nazi-like organization which is organizing their annual marches, and everybody is looking away. Somehow this seems to be a forgotten chapter of European history. The lessons that we were supposed to learn from World War II.
No, it's a big problem. And here's the deal. The reason why these are tolerated is because, as I explained with the Banderas, they're going to rewrite history. And instead of focusing on what they really were, which are pro-Nazi, racial supremacists who carried out horrific crimes, they're going to say that they were nationalists fighting the evils of communism, and that Putin is the modern day manifestation of that communist threat. And therefore, this is why it's dangerous. You see right now in various nations like the Baltics, Ukraine, Poland, Bulgaria, to a lesser extent, where they are seeking to erase the history of the Great Patriotic War. They are seeking to erase the monuments. They're seeking to treat the Soviet or the Red Army not as liberators, but as conquerors, as occupiers. And in doing so, they're altering the narrative so that they can promote those who fought against the Soviets as nationalists. And so any Latvian or Estonian or Lithuanian who joined the Waffen SS and carried out horrific crimes in support of the Nazi master plan is now being reclassified not as a Nazi, but as a nationalist. They forget about, they tried to minimize Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich and maximize that these guys were fighting communists, therefore they are nationalists. And so the Russians have become a replacement for the communists. So now they're anti-Russian, therefore they're good, they need to be promoted. And it's just a bait and switch that's taking place throughout Europe. It's a very dangerous thing. And again, what I don't understand is how the United States allows this to happen. Because we did fight against Nazi Germany, together with the Soviets, together with the French, together with the British, together with the Canadians. We suffered greatly. We lost a lot of people in this struggle, in this fight, and we disgraced their memory. We disgraced the cause at that time by turning a blind eye to the resurrection of that which we fought hard to defeat. Now, people will say the United States has never been very consistent because, our denazification policy post World War II was more like a jobs fair as opposed to genuine denazification. We brought them into our intelligence services. We brought them into our scientific community. Heck, one of them took us to the moon. So, we were not perfect in that regard, but we never promoted the ideology. We turned a blind eye to the sins of the past, but we never openly promoted neo-Nazi ideology in the way that it's being promoted today in the Baltics and in other places in Europe. It's very disturbing about our silence. And for me, it's personally disturbing because I had relatives who fought against Nazi Germany, and I take the resurrection of this odious ideology personally.
Well, I'll continue in a bit different direction. Russia is already using Iranian intelligence and attack drones and rockets. There are recent claims that China might be involved in the side of Russia by supplying military technology as well. Why does Russia need to use third country weapons? Does it mean that Russia is short of the weaponry that is necessary for solving the conflict? Or is there something else we don't see?
Well, I think we're looking at two different problems here. The Chinese have been accused of perhaps providing artillery ammunition to the Russians. The North Koreans were accused of that earlier. Indeed, there was some wild speculation that the Iranians were providing artillery to the Russians. on the drones, let's put it this way: the Russians had a drone doctrine developed for this conflict, which was based upon certain assumptions about what war would look like. And it turned out that they were wrong about those assumptions. So the Russian drone technology and the drone methodologies were not adequate to the task that now confronted them in Ukraine. And so what Russia did is what any other, I'll give you an example. I was a Marine back in the 1980s, and we wanted to incorporate drone technology into the Marine Corps. We had American companies developing drones, but there was one country out there that was using drones actively. It had a certain level of expertise. That was Israel. So we went to Israel and we acquired the Israeli drone technology, brought it back, adapted it for our use. Are you trying to tell me that the United States lacked the industrial capacity to do drones? No, we didn't lack it, but there was somebody out there who did it better. And so in the short term, we would take that technology, adapt it, and then grow it here at home. The Russians looked around and saw the Iranians had a whole range of drones that had a history of operational employment, by the Yemenis against the Saudis, by Syria and Hezbollah against the Israelis. And so the Russians went there, examined this, and made a determination that in order to stabilize the drone war, which was not going in their favor, they needed to acquire this technology and incorporate it into their emerging doctrine. And they did so. But look at what they've done. They've taken some of the operational concepts and developed their own technologies. For instance, the Lancet, I think it is. It's a suicidal loitering drone produced by the Kalashnikov concern. It's been improved and it's been produced in larger numbers, and it's having a bearing on the battlefield. But the improvements came from an understanding of Iranian drone tactics, Iranian drone technology. The Russians adapted it, and now they're producing it itself. There's nothing wrong with that. That's actually pretty smart. They've incorporated Iranian designs, but they've built their own designs. And today, the Russians are global leaders in the incorporation of drone technology into the battlefield. So it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of adaptability and actually strength, because the Russian defense industry was able to receive drone technology, then adapt it to the realities of the battlefield in Ukraine to produce a new drone weapon, an improved drone weapon. So, but then we look at the artillery issue. One, it's a Western propaganda myth that Russia's running out of ammunition. Just ask the Ukrainians, who get hammered by Russian artillery on a daily basis. Russia did nearly triple the size of its military presence in Ukraine through mobilization, et cetera. And unless you triple the size of your artillery ammunition production, when you enlarge the number of people needing artillery ammunition and you haven't increased the production, it means that you are going to dilute what they call the norm, the amount of ammunition allocated to each unit for a given operational period. So there has been, in certain cases, a diminishment of ammunition support to units. It's not because the Russians are running out of ammunition. It's that the Russians have created a larger consumption base for this ammunition. Russia is trying to produce more ammunition as we speak. You have production lines going double shifts, triple shifts, and I believe that they are meeting the needs of the front from a Russian ammunition perspective. The North Korean provision ammunition has proven to have been false. The Iranian one has proven to have been false. On China, it hasn't been consummated yet, but I personally believe that not only would China never do this because it violates issues of Chinese Westphalian principles regarding sovereignty and the interference in the nation and the affairs of other nations, but more importantly, this war is an artillery-driven conflict, meaning that the role played by Russian artillery is dominant. So if Russia wants to, for instance, launch a major offensive in the near future, Russia is going to need to have artillery ammunition that then can be expended at a certain rate, sort of like a throttle for the battle. So you want to go on the offensive, you up the throttle, increase ammunition expenditure, and it has to be there from a planning perspective to meet the operational requirements. If they now give this ability to provide the fuel to China, which says, hey, China, in order to support our operation, we need you to give us the ammunition, Russia's hands no longer on the throttle. China's hands on the throttle. What nation is going to allow that to happen? What nation is going to say, we're at war, a war that we view as an existential battle for survival, but here, China, you have control over the throttle. And when I tell you to increase, you increase. When I tell you to decrease, you decrease. That's fine if China's playing that game. But what happens if the United States says, hey, China, we'd like to cut a deal with Taiwan? And suddenly the Chinese are going, oh, really? What do we need to do? You need to throttle down. And suddenly the ships that were supposed to be shipped, the factories go out of business, the trains don't run, and the throttle is throttled down right at the time when Russia needs the ammunition. Why would Russia do that? Why would Russia put itself in that situation? It's strategically stupid, excuse my language. So I don't believe about the Chinese ammunition. I believe that Russia recognizes the importance of artillery ammunition and that Russia has geared up its military industrial capacity to produce sufficient artillery for any military needs on the battlefield.
And can we see, realistically speaking, present disagreement among the members of the NATO alliance? And if so, what the consequences of that might be?
What kind of agreement?
The disagreement, present disagreement among the members.
Well, it's funny because if you listen to Lloyd Austin, if you listen to Mark Miley, if you listen to anybody on Stoltenberg, Joe Biden, NATO's never been this unified. It's the strongest it's ever been, NATO. But that's a lie. There's huge disagreements in NATO and some of them have nothing to do with Ukraine. Ask yourself what the relationship between Turkey and Greece is. Best buddies or mortal enemies? What about Turkey and France? Wasn't it a fact that just a little while ago that French warships were threatened by Turkish warships about interdiction of a convoy heading to Libya? There's a problem. What about Germany and Poland? The Poles demanding reparations, the Germans telling them maybe Silesia might be Germany again. That wasn't official, but there's, you want to play the game of we owe you money, then you owe us territory. What happens when Hungary makes a move on the Transcarpathian regions of Ukraine to redraw the boundaries and bring in the Hungarian population, or the Romanians do the same? Turkey and Hungary aren't too happy about Finland and Sweden becoming members. So there's not unity. And here's the biggest one of all, the biggest wild card in all of this. Germany was just attacked by the United States. The Nord Stream pipelines, America, economic Pearl Harbor, stabbing our ally in the back. NATO, this wonderful unity, NATO is breaking apart. And what's going to cause NATO to break apart further is a decisive Russian victory in Ukraine, which exposes the paper tiger status of NATO and will compel NATO, if it seeks to respond to this, to increase defense expenditures by orders of magnitude when there is no industrial capacity. And if there even were an industrial capacity, they couldn't afford it because the price of energy has gone up 3, 4, 5 times what it was before this conflict, for the simple fact that they shut themselves off from Russian energy. So NATO is going to be confronted with, the fact that they've created a boogeyman called Russia that has now become a real boogeyman, and NATO can't deal with it. And the NATO organization is fundamentally broken, yet the United States, the puppet master, will continue to put demands on NATO that affect it militarily and economically. And never forget, it's the United States that attacked Germany and helped create this condition to begin with. I think NATO doesn't have long to live. I think after this conflict, Europe is going to have one of those very difficult internal discussions where they say, we need to have a discussion about European security without the United States involvement. Henry Kissinger famously or infamously said, I get in trouble quoting Kissinger, but you can't deny that whatever you think of him, he played the game at the highest levels and he's knowledgeable. He said it's very dangerous to be America's enemy, but it's lethal to be America's friend. And that's so true. Ask the Vietnamese, ask the Iraqis, ask the Afghanis, ask the Kurds, ask the Ukrainians. You don't want to be America's friend because America's a friend to nobody. America only cares about America. For all those nations out there that want to join or that are members of NATO or thought that joining NATO was going to be a good thing because you're a great American friend, we don't like you. We don't need you. We only want you to do what we want. We're willing to sacrifice you. Ask the Georgian people, what's it feel like to be part of the crescent of conflict, the crescent of instability? You know what it means when the United States has designated the Southern Caucasus region as a crescent of instability to put pressure on Russia? It means your country will be destabilized. It means your life will be uncertain. It means you could be involved in a war that leads to the destruction of your nation. Is that how friends help friends? Friends are supposed to help you prosper, supposed to help you have a good economy, a good system. Friends aren't supposed to lead you down the path of national suicide, which is what America has done with Ukraine and is doing with Georgia, and frankly speaking, we will do to every member of NATO. We don't like you. We use you. That's it. And if you don't understand that, then good luck. But America will never be your friend because we don't want friends. You see, to be a friend implies equality. If I'm your friend, I care about you. I treat you as an equal. We are the American hegemon. The world revolves around us. We are the singularity. And everybody else is in support of us. And that support is not a two-way street. It is a one-way street. We take your resources to our advantage. We do not provide our resources to your advantage. And the world needs to understand that. NATO needs to understand that. Europe needs to understand that. If Europe doesn't start focusing on its own legitimate security requirements, which should at the very least include buying cheap Russian gas, because the Russians are not seeking to dominate Europe. They're not seeking to exploit that. Russia is seeking a business relationship where they make money and you save money. Ask yourself how the German economy got to be where it is. Decades of cheap Russian gas that allowed them to save trillions of euros over the market price of energy. And they took those trillions of euros and they reinvested them into Germany to have good jobs, good standard of living, good healthcare, good everything. That's gone. Auf Wiedersehen, goodbye. And it ain't coming back if you're going to continue to buy American liquid natural gas, which we're going to gladly sell you because we don't like you. See, if we liked you, we'd say, what were you paying for Russian gas? Here, we're going to give you American gas at the same price. That's not what we're saying. We're saying, forget about Russian gas. You got to buy American gas. Oh, I'm sorry. It's about markets. So the market, you got to pay 5 times as much. I'm sorry, but you're going to pay because you have no alternative now because we took away your only alternative, cheap Russian gas. Is that how a friend operates? And the answer is no. But that's how we operate because we're not your friend.
I would like to continue about the scenario of war. I have recently heard from a Russian military specialist by the name of Konstantin Valentinovich Sivkov. Maybe you know him. He suggests that German diesel-electric submarines with German crew might be delivered to the Ukrainians and used against the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. The Russian analysts said that the submarines might enter the Black Sea through Bosphorus, hidden from the Turkish military, or even with their agreement. What are your thoughts on that? Is it possible?
I don't believe it's possible to transit the Bosphorus without the Turks knowing. So I take that off the table. Would the Turks allow this to happen without telling anybody? I don't believe so. Look, remember, Turkey blames NATO for this war. Turkey's now one of those nations that says Russia had an unprovoked act of aggression. Turkey supports Ukraine. They support Ukraine on the issue of Crimea because of the Crimean Tatars. Turkey leans towards them, etc. But Turkey's not one of these nations that said, that this war is a good thing and expanding this war would be a good thing. So why would Turkey then secretly allow these submarines to come through and go? If you don't think the Russians know how to detect submarines and how to kill submarines, then you don't know anything about the Russians. These submarines have no chance of ever making it to the Black Sea. And if they did, they wouldn't survive. They would be sunk immediately. Submarine operations are very tricky. So where are the Ukrainian crews going to come from? Are these German submarines going to come with German crews?
Exactly. That's the idea.
And the German government's willing to put a couple hundred men on a submarine that will be sunk immediately and they'll all die?
Well, no comment.
Yeah, I mean, so no, I just think this is fanciful. I think what's happening now is that people are saying Ukraine is losing. Well, here, let me give you another thing. How long would this take? This would take some time. It isn't going to happen tonight. So the submarines would have to be identified. Are they going to be new submarines, or are they going to take submarines out of the German Navy? They're taking them out of the German Navy. They have to take away all the NATO specific equipment, all the communications equipment, everything. They have to rewire it, everything, because you're not going to give the Ukrainians a NATO submarine, because the Ukrainians aren't part of NATO. So they don't get our codes. They don't get our secret communications capability. They don't get anything of that nature. So the submarine has to be gutted and rewired. That's going to take, I don't know, a year. And then the German crew is going to have to come up with some sort of contract vehicle. Are they going to be German sailors who are going to be sheep dipped, meaning that they sign a piece of paper that says, I leave the German Navy, and then they sign another piece of paper that says, I'm a private military contractor for this period of service, but with the secret agreement that goes back in that if they survive this war, they can come back and get credit time served for their pensions, because the Germans are very legalistic. I haven't met a German sailor yet that's willing to walk away from his pension. His lifetime guarantee of health care, vacations, all this stuff. Germans aren't Ukrainian patriots. So if they did this, it would have to be not because they believe in the Ukrainian cause, but they believe in the money. Has that money been identified, et cetera? But even when they do this, getting that submarine from point A to point B, it's not going to be done in secret. It's going to be known. And as soon as it enters the Black Sea, there's going to be a Russian submarine waiting for it right there. And the Russian submarine's going to kill it right there. And 200 German sailors are going to die right there. This just is, it's a non-starter. It's part of the fanciful thinking done by people who are trying to explore how this war could be expanded. But it's like the F-16 fighter. This war is going to be over before an F-16 fighter could ever be deployed to Ukraine. So why are we talking about the F-16 fighter when it's purely theoretical? Why are we talking about M1 tanks? They're not showing up until next year anyways, even if we manage to open up the production line and build these new tanks from scratch with the very bad armor that the Russians can kill that quick. So I just view these as flights of fantasy. These are intellectual games, mental games being played, but they have nothing to do with reality. There will never be a German submarine in the Black Sea working for the Ukrainian Navy.